of being influenced by his writings. As far as this Project Cuso conference is concerned, there was a professor, Dr. James Zarza-Diaz, who gave us an hour-long primer of Filipino American history, which included a whole host of other things, but one of them is he was describing the Hart-Celler Act, which I will get to shortly, that kind of contributed to the development of the model minority myth, right? So for those that read the article, I particularly have picked on the National Science Foundation. The NSF is a federal agency that supports and funds fundamental non-medical STEM initiatives across U.S. academic institutions and multiple fields. It also releases these biannual reports tracking the progress of underrepresented minorities in demographics and STEM. I will talk a little bit about the criticisms that came out of me, particularly piecing out NSF, but I used NSF as an example. And some of the criticisms or critiques really that are made or applied to NSF can be made to other institutions, organizations such as NIH, AAAS, the Association of American Medical Colleges, and so much more. In fact, I was looking, I'm not gonna really talk about this, but AAAS has actually released a baseline assessment of demographic representation within the AAAS executive and organizational committee. So what's really nice about NSF is that the survey and demographic data that they collected are pretty much open access. You can download the data and the reports and kind of see where at least a snapshot of where the demographics of underrepresented minorities are within a good chunk of the STEM spaces. So here in this graph, so one of the things that they mentioned in this report from 2019 is they were suggesting that Asians are overrepresented in science and engineering, which is a pretty broad statement. And I will say, if you are skeptical, I do encourage you to read the latest statement on the NSF. So here is one of the example graphs, which they have a lot of, by the way, that showed the employment of scientists and engineers back in 2017. The Asian that were surveyed in science and engineering are the ones in pink. And if you look at this graph, there is a little kernel of truth in that if you look at the employed full-time and employed part-time, Asians are seemingly more well-represented than underrepresented groups such as Hispanic Latinos, Blacks or African Americans, Native Hawaiians, etc. But overall, Asian people representation paled in comparison to white people that are employed full-time and employed part-time. And so one of the things that I addressed in the article is the cautions of aggregating this data, of aggregating demographic data. I will say I'm not the first person to be skeptical of this kind of data. This is another Viewpoint article by Co Grischbeck that's published in the bulletin of the ESA. And what's nice about this graph, she pulled up US Census data, which is this yellow line right here. And she also pulled off the NSF data of ecology PhD recipients. And even though Asian Americans overall have represent 5% of the population, in 2018, they only represent 3% of ecology PhDs, right? So there is a little bit of nuance when you try to piece out the demographics based on race and ethnicity, and also by major, is one of the key arguments that I was trying to get at with the article. And so I made allusions to that I argued that this supposed overrepresentation of Asians in STEM could be an artifact of the racist anti-Black model minority myth. And it does help to, learn some history related to the model minority myth, right? So if you look at some immigration policies that were previously, passed related to Asians, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 are laws that are passed that prohibit, ban immigration of Asians. First, it was Chinese laborers, and then it was effectively banning most Asians from entering the U.S. Through a quota system. For those that are really history savvy, I put most Asians here because it turns out there was one exception to this Johnson-Reed Act, and I'm not going to really look at the chat, but I'll let y'all decide what that exception of the Johnson-Reed Act is. So 1882, 1924, these racist laws were passed. And then we have the civil rights movement, which again, this is an oversimplification of the history of Asians and Asian Americans. So the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1968, one of the things that came out of the civil rights movement was the Hart-Celler Act, which effectively overturned these two laws that are barring the Asians from immigrating to the US. These overturning of these previous two laws opened up the immigrations of Asians that also included high-skilled labor. And then all of a sudden you have this diversity of laborers, be it upper class or middle class, that resulted from this Immigration Act. Concurrently, during the Civil Rights Movement era, there was this sociologist, William Peterson, who published this article in the New York Times that compared Japanese Americans to Black Americans, and he was making the argument that the hardworking, family-oriented Japanese Americans that were oppressed during the internment camps, during World War II, they all of a sudden they bounced back better compared to, I put it as opposed to lazy, disruptive Black Americans, African Americans, and through those two events that concurred is the development of the model minority myth, in which the Asian community at large is kind of has been re-examining this model minority myth for a long time, because in the event of the reinvigoration of Black Lives Matter protests, there are discourses that this model minority myth is a tool of anti-Blackness, and a tool to uphold white supremacy in our society, if you will. So this is the oversimplified history of the model minority myth. But I do encourage you to read a lot more related to it, because there's only so much you can fit into an article. And so when I think about, are we really underrepresented minorities, right? And I'm very iffy really about that label, because I don't think we're not as much minorities as we are minoritized, where we have to face obstacles and barriers that would marginalize or exclude us as Filipinos in STEM. And doing a little bit of research myself, I do recommend reading one of the articles by Tiffany L. Williams. She advocated for the abolition of underrepresented minorities because partly of this reason. This seminar talk that I attended earlier this semester by David Asai, he was citing some articles, but he suggested switching underrepresented minorities to peers excluded by ethnicity or race, or peers, right? So when this article was released last month, it of course a lot of some praise, but it also caused some controversy. I was in contact with a professor of another Filipino STEM organization, the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering, and I was exposed to this huge listserv of discourses where they, where there was a discussion about the article and some of the points that I was considering. So for example, NSF is already committed to diversity. Turns out there are some members of HASE that are working as program managers of NSF. There was a professor that argued that Asian Americans are overrepresented in terms of population size and STEM award achievement. But that same professor made the caveat that Asian women are still considered underrepresented. Numbers dwindled in academic positions after doctoral attainment, and she cited a figure by the Association of American Medical Colleges in 2018. And finally, there are other institutions that have somewhat altered or added caveats to their definition of a URM or considered setting specific cases. NIH has acknowledged this. They said that if you feel that you are a minority within your institution, go ahead and apply to some of those specific grants for URMs anyway. And so when I was, kind of viewing this, these conversations, I was, a little hesitant at first. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this thing is being torn apart, right? But I hope these are discussions that I hope, cause better change or at least a greater awareness of where we are as Filipinos in STEAM, if you will. And at the end, I usually talked about different action items that institutions and agencies can go, being able to educate yourself on different perspectives of science. I know we make a big deal out of data-driven policy, but it also helps to learn from also historical and philosophical perspectives. And there's also the power of personal storytelling. Having some kind of accountability on, I think I mentioned committee where you make sure that racist micro or macroaggressions are minimized, and being able to consult anti-racist, anti-bias educators. Of course, you're not limited to these action items. And I was also influenced by this article that was published in Scientific American by 500 women scientists during June of this year. And that was shared to my anti-racist book club as well. But I'm gonna check the chat shortly because I know there's some conversations going on. But I do want to bring AFSA into this. Obviously, I cannot speak on behalf of all Filipinos in STEM. I am only an individual, but I do hope we can get some conversations related to that. Particularly how has your identity as a Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx, and diaspora influence your sense of belonging on your STEAM spaces. And this is timely because we had our advocacy meeting less than a week ago. What strategies or actions AFSA can do to advocate for justice, equity, diversity, inclusion in STEAM academic and professional spaces. And with that, I'll take any questions or comments. I'll stop blabbering. Okay. I don't know the right demographics. No Indigenous folks. Oh, okay. Wait, hold on a sec. Does anyone have any questions that I need to answer in the chat? It's being a little quiet. Hello?
I think your presentation was good. I don't really have any questions. No,
oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah, no questions here either, but I think you did a really great job. I can't speak for everyone.
I also read your article when it came out, and chef's kiss.
What kind of labor have Filipinos ABIs been allowed to do historically? Nursing, if I remember correctly, for Filipinos. When I mentioned the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, Filipinos were kind of an exception to that law, because I think at that time the Philippines was a U.S. colony. And oh my gosh, I wish I remember this part of the history as well. I do remember, don't quote me on this, y'all, but the development of Chinese food restaurants was also rooted with this exclusion of Chinese people, because I think at that time, and again, I don't remember, but the immigrants that came to the US, they are mostly restricted to low-income labor, definitely not your white-collar types of labor. So I don't think I'd be able to answer that really well. But the Chinese Exclusion Act, birth of the yellow peril, scare we can trace to COVID-19 anti-Asian sentiment. And I would also argue we're kind of facing some yellow peril as well. I don't know, you all could look this up, but even if you were to argue that, you know, Chinese, for example, are overrepresented, and I'm putting that in quotes, I do remember reading that a lot of Chinese scientists overseas got visas denied. They can't study in America because of the accusation that they could be communist spies. So just a little C to add right here. The difference between Japanese, Chinese, okay, I'm reading your stuff, it's interesting, is that Japanese and Chinese immigrants had at least government was U.S. best interests to negotiate a relationship with. So in some sense, these groups have more protections or, huh? Hold on a sec.
Yes, Lowell, I'll just ask you my questions. I just kind of was making comments as you were going on with the legislature that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
But I'm curious what your response to that question is how is being a Filipino, identifying as a Filipino in STEAM influenced your perception of the field, or even your, just your experience, how you would answer your own question.
Oh my gosh. It's been a lot. I would like to say thanks AFSA for, for having this community to exist, to, I guess, not be alone on the realization that I am both a Filipino and a scientist. And I can attest during my undergrad, I've been involved in Filipino clubs and was consistently the only non-medical, non-healthcare related STEM major at that time. And I've been in spaces where, I am in a STEM space, but I can be one of 2 or 3 Filipinos in that space. And I do feel, at that time, a disconnect, juggling these 2 different identities. And I guess when I first started realizing that, I am frustrated with that, because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm like the only Filipino scientist, and there are times where you're better off being a medical doctor or a nurse, that sort of thing. Or I was told, I could be the next Charles Darwin. What does that mean? I guess there's another thing too. 3 years ago when I published that article at Kubo, I used to believe that diversity matters, representation matters, and diversity is a goal. And I felt and I still feel a little bit of that, but I also feel, representation is the bare minimum that you need. You also got to consider, is the environment that you're in, supportive? Do you feel belong in a STEM space? I mean, being a Filipino, and when I first read the book, Latinos Age, I've once again felt this weird tangent. I was like, what exactly is a Filipino? Is a Filipino Asian? Is it Latino? Is Pacific Islander? That sort of thing. And I had that little identity crisis in California. When I moved to Miami, that got re-examined because I guess the Asian side of being Filipino kind of shot up, being surrounded by Hispanic, Latino majority. And I don't know what to say. I guess
it's very like context based. It's like depends on where you're.
It's heavily context based. Absolutely, there's a lot of nuance, and it really depends on the local geography where you grew up in. I guess my sense of being Filipino would have been a lot different had I been born and raised in Los Angeles or at San Francisco. Instead, I was born and raised in San Bernardino, which is a lot more, you know, Hispanic, Mexican, Black dominant areas with some other Asians like Vietnamese and Chinese, and you know, Filipinos are pretty scattered in San Bernardino.
I found that graph that you shared really interesting, and just like the idea of racial categorizations, you know, being something that's constructed. It's not a genetic or biological fact, but it's a social process. And I always find it interesting whenever I just see like Asian, because since becoming more connected to, I guess, the Filipino American, I kind of moved away from just calling myself an Asian American woman or an API, because there is so much part of identity that isn't captured there. There's, you know, working class. Are you an indigenous? Then are you living in the Philippines? Are you living in the Netherlands, like Fred, or in New Jersey? And I think that just aggregating everything to Asian sometimes just feels like so like superficial because it doesn't capture so many things. Like, okay, do Asian, we're obviously just talking about East Asian and capturing that mostly rather than other parts of the global South. Like, do you mean Laotian people? Do you mean Cambodian people? So it's so valuable that you're in your field because you can be that person to just, not that you shouldn't be doing this by yourself, but, you know, making those counter narratives to the tendency to kind of make Asian experiences like really monolithic. So yeah, data is funny, but it kind of helps. It's what we use to understand things in a broader sense, but I feel like more specificity is always important. So thanks for this. This is really awesome.
It's just continue on and build off of Christiana's like comment. Yeah, I mean, I think you could, I mean, within even like Filipino American, you could like go more specific as well. I mean, it just depends on the scope. I mean, I think, yeah, you mean like you I guess let's say you start with like Asian and then you go like which region and everything. I do think though, I think like, you know, people would say like, oh, Filipinos shouldn't even be part of Asians. Like though I do think like the Asian demographic has more of a solidarity like kind of component. That's just what I kind of foresee. Like, although, yeah, like, you know, there's differences, which is, I think, you know, people just should think of that there's diversity within things in general. But yeah, but I do think, yeah, like the solidarity part is nice because I think there's still shared within the Asian demographic, but then also there's like the uniqueness. So yeah, it's definitely like a big like conversation. I thought your the graph that you showed was interesting. Well, the one with like the when you like people are like, oh yeah, Asians are like overrepresented, but then like you see this like huge like green part that's clearly over 50%.
Yeah.
If you removed like the races and then just showed like someone a graph like, oh, which one's the one that's overrepresented, I don't think people are gonna pick the pink the pink one.
Right.
Honestly. So yeah, I mean that's just, yeah, I mean obviously, yeah, it's just weird to like have a conversation like that one is overrepresented, but it's clearly not in relation. Maybe it's overrepresented within like, I guess, let's say the other minority populations, but like why are you comparing like those? Like, are we only supposed to have X amount of, yeah, and like do we have, we're only supposed to have X amount of Asians and X amount of this race and X amount of this race, but wait, we don't have to count apparently. Like we have as many as we want. So those like, yeah, those weird conversations. But that weird, you know, people are trying to change and like by diversifying and stuff. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I know there are also, I guess, conversations about, you know, Asian solidarity because Well, first of all, what is solidarity? I mean, the last kind of solidarity that you probably want to have is one that, just says, we're all Asians. And then it kind of erases the, diversity of, groups that some are more oppressed or underrepresented. And that's kind of the dangers of, aggregating your groups into one single label, right? And actually, I kind of want to add this too, because I guess this aggregation of Asians and the comparison of white people is still kind of happening. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but there was a seminar that I attended earlier this semester. And she was showing a graph by a paper that was published last year of URMs versus white/Asian. And I think that study, I didn't get a chance to read all of it because I wanted to include that, but I didn't have the time, of when you're trying to do, conduct education, a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And consistently, the whites and Asians will be always a little more than the URMs, but with the growth mindset, you get a little more. But it's like, how many Asians would have, benefited from the growth mindset? I'm pretty sure many other Asian groups would definitely benefit from that growth mindset as well. That was a paper by, let me see, by Kenning. I don't know if you want me to share that as well. So, anyone want to share any personal stories related to being a Filipino in STEM, or what should AFSA do?
Well, I wanted to say quickly. So, I think at one of the mentor-mentee sessions, my mentor is Dr. Francis Castro, and he does he said he did a peer review of a paper that was looking at Asians being overrepresented in STEM, and then he told them he couldn't he couldn't verify this, or he couldn't support this paper because it broke the Asian category, it defined it too widely. So then he told them to go back and segregate that data a bit more, and they found that Filipinos were specifically underrepresented in STEM. So then I think I'll ask him about it, and I'll share it with you guys later. But yeah, I think even with me and being in math, I feel Asians and Filipinos are as a culture, from a lot of the people around me, it feels like we're pressured to go into immediately profitable markets, and then I really felt a real push to not go into math because it's not so financially stabilizing. So I think that's where I struggle then, because I feel sometimes Asians are overrepresented in mathematics, but then I feel I don't think I've met a Filipino mathematician. So I think that's kind of weird for me.
Absolutely, Rodney. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to dive in?
I think I can, because I don't know. I tried this weird line of I'm pre-med. Technically, I'm on this med track and going into healthcare and all of that, but I'm engineering. So at my core is in my classes, I go to a CUNY, so it's a pretty diverse school. But even it's I understand Asians in engineering are pretty high, but it's I cannot tell you one Filipino engineer I've met in my courses or in my field or in industry, and then let alone a female one. That's another step of I know the only one other female engineer in my entire school at this point. So it's you can't tell me in spaces that I'm represented, but I'm not. And it's the same thing of I'm applying to med school right now. And I've been told to my face by people yeah, there are too many Filipinos in healthcare. And I'm you can't tell me that, because it's not Filipinos in healthcare isn't the monolithic thing of oh, they're in medicine. No, there's a lot of nurses, there's a lot of therapists, and there's a lot of positions that are in healthcare generally. But I've been told at sadly at diversity events where it's there are a lot of Filipinos in healthcare, but not in the positions or in leadership or in medicine that I want to be in. So it's like, it's weird going into a space where you know that there are representation of you, like in terms of being Filipino and even in administration, but not in the positions that I'm going to. So it's like weird arguing these conversations with people because they're always just like, yeah, like you do you, but I'm also recognizing that because I'm clumped under Asian, because I'm from the boroughs, and because I'm a woman, that in my application pool, I'm technically not, like, I don't stand out in any way, shape, or form because Filipinos kind of fall under this umbrella. And then Filipinos, when you hear Filipino in medicine, you're like, oh, nursing. And I'm like, I've been told like, oh, so you're applying to nursing school. And I'm like, no, like I have to flat out tell people like, I'm not going to nursing school. I'm not going into therapy. I'm applying for like very specific programs where I don't see people that look like me, even though it's a healthcare field. So it's weird. It's a strange time to navigate this, but that's what I've been doing. And you just kind of have to call it out as you see it. And I think in terms of like what AFSA can do and all that is the same thing like you said, like you can only do so much. And it's hard because DEI in America is strange where like, yeah, we pluck all the colored people and or Asians or mixed people and tell them to do the work that other people should be already doing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, it's kind of like as individuals, all we can do is hold people accountable and continually like push our narrative. And then at AFSA, like collectively, we have a group of people who also feel the same way. So it's like finding support in community and saying like, oh, it's not just me. It's like me and like 300 other people who feel the same way in their own fields. So that's why like this is a cool space and an interesting space to explore these narratives. Because it's like I've always separated my Filipino identity, where I was in the Filipino clubs, I've done all the cultural things, and my science identity in two different spaces. Like I exist in those spaces of different people, but then having a space like this enters a duality where you can argue that these are important.
Absolutely, that's the T. Oh gosh. Anyone else have to jump in? It's at the top of the hour. Should we keep going? I don't know what to do.
I have a question, Lowell.
Yeah.
I first of all, thank you for sharing all of this. I read your article before I logged in, but I think I missed the first few minutes. Do you have any kind of studies, or can you point me to resources to read more about the impacts of misrepresentation in STEM, like how it affects our daily lives? You know, like what does it mean if most of the things in STEM are built or published by white people? How does it affect us? Like that kind of stuff. And another thing, I think that these stats are mainly in the US, right?
Yes.
So like, I mean, like this is just me like having a brain fart, but like, you know, like I wonder what it's like strategically, if you know, like APSA is not a global APSA is not a global organization, but like for example, globally, like what we're looking at right now is the lens is a very American lens, and maybe that's because like science, like America is like in the forefront of technology and all of that, so it matters. But like I wonder what it would look like if Asia or China kind of becomes the #1 powerhouse in producing publications or things like that, like how the world would look differently in that sense, because then DEI in the US or in Europe might not even matter that much if the powerhouses were actually in Asia. And if so, is it even more worth, or like is the impact of investment in those places like more powerful than doing DEI initiatives here? What do you think?
Oh my gosh, such a complex question. Thanks for asking. First of all, I literally wrote down your resources and misrepresentation. I'll have to look at that. I'll have to look at that too. And hopefully I'll get back to you on that one. As far as oh my gosh, I guess that's definitely one of the shortcomings of my article, isn't it? That it's mostly focused on data in America, right? I used NSF data, and I don't know if the contexts are similar in other Western countries, or as you said, non-Western countries like China, for example. And I don't know how to answer that. I think I remember going to another talk a couple years ago, and there was this guy who kind of asked a very similar question, but he was saying, "Oh, America has historically, produced great science, whatever that is." And the presenter who was presenting this diversity work, he was saying that it's not so much the quality as well as also the quantity of the work being involved. And if you have diverse voices, if you will, that's going to bring in new perspectives that should be re-examined, which kind of come from our personal experiences, what we're educated in and how we're educated in, and that will hopefully enrich whatever discourse of science or engineering that of whatever it is that's being developed. And I guess that's also why this article mentions a lot about race and ethnicity, but there's also this actual nuance of intersections related to gender and sexuality and disability, and those things matter too, right? So in a global context, I feel like I wish I could definitely say, because I'm a Filipino American, and a lot of what I learned growing up is primarily Westernized. I wish I could answer more of that question, but this is why we need to have these conversations, and to see what perspectives are out there that aren't within the Western sphere of education and influence, if you will. I think it would depend on their economic interests. Do they reflect the same value as the US? It could be one way. And I think as an ecologist, some of the ecology does tie into economics. Sorry guys, I'm like totally brain farting as well right now. So yeah. Anyone else want to say anything?
I guess just to quickly give my thoughts on the question. Just like, I think if the question is like, oh, like why is there a need to diversify in the US or like Western countries? Like, is there a need to do that in like I guess predominantly like one ethnicity, kind of like China, was like obviously it's probably going to be a very large amount of Chinese ethnicities, but like I think then, I mean, just the simple fact is like diversity kind of just brings a lot into, you gain a lot from diversity in general. So if you just want to say like in the US, we're gay, like, there's positives in diversity. I feel like there's only positives in diversity. And then those certain countries that like don't diversify, they don't have to, but like, I think at the same time, they're still missing that aspect of like, they're not going to get that kind of diverse perspectives of different ethnicities and whatsoever. I think there's also the fact that the people who are in the US were not like the original people that would like have been there.
Right.
That warrants that, everyone who came after like should be equal technically, because everyone's not the first. I guess like, yeah, like the Native Americans were like indigenous peoples were the first to be there. So
right,
like, I think that's pushed for more why there's need to be diversity, because different people came in arguably the same time, but it just so happened that history brought one race more than the rest. But yeah,
I guess that also brings in how my perspectives changed over time, because even though diversity matters, once you're in a position of power, like you're an administrator or a full-time professor, how are you changing the structures that marginalizes these groups in STEAM in the first place, right? If you're an administrator, you know, are you just keeping business as usual, or are you, you know, advocating for policies to, you know, have more people included, or re-examining, you know, policies within academia that are, you know, very harmful to especially Black and Indigenous people of color, right? So I guess for me, you know, I used to see diversity as an end in itself, and now it's just a means to an end, right? We want to make sure that the education and the research developed at academia is not just given to a few people, but also, you know, to those that are, you know, that are marginalized and even disenfranchised by science and academia. And there's a whole history of, you know, Black and Indigenous people being exploited and abused. You know, Black people, for example, they were, there was the very infamous Tuskegee study. Of course, the US is built on stolen land. You know, how do we ecologists acknowledge, you know, the research that we do in lands that are technically unceded? Depending on the local situation related to those Indigenous groups, of course. Let's see. This question is actually for everyone. I'm currently researching on reasons why philams are underrepresented in science. And the reasons, this is from Precious, the reasons I plan on focusing on is familial influence, cultural values. Raleigh did mention that Filipinos are encouraged to pursue careers that are more financially stable. So as Filipino scientists, when did you decide you're going to become first a scientist? How do your parents' families react? Did you have an argument? Precious, do you have a survey? I think this is something, I don't know if this is, if you have IRB, if you know what that is. These could be survey-worthy questions. So I don't know if you want me to answer these or explain them.
Yeah, feel free to do so. I'm just like currently like gathering insights, and it would be nice to like hear what everyone thinks about it. Yeah.
I guess very briefly, I do feel, you know, I guess a lot like Romney, I do feel that pushback of initial pushback of, you know, being an ecologist and, you know, being pushed towards being either a nurse or a doctor. I think what finally prevented, you know, my parents to basically cede and for me to pursue my, you know, dreams of being an ecologist is the attainment of an internship that I got doing field work. And it wasn't even related to my major, it was geology. And I guess that's definitely, you know, one of the things that can help be, you know, remediated is this providing of opportunities, preferably paid or compensated opportunities to, you know, do STEM. Because not only are you getting that experience to be a scientist, but there's a good chance, you know, you might be able to communicate, you know, what to your parents or to your family, you know, that this is tangible work. You know, this is work where you get paid to, you know, conduct research and be out in the field and, you know, do these different things. Yeah, so, and I guess as time went on, getting, you know, more opportunity by opportunity, that helped solidify my position that, yes, I could be a scientist. At the same time, I also do acknowledge that there's definitely some class privilege involved. I mean, my parents immigrated here, then, you know, quote unquote, worked hard and maintained financial stability. I think the trajectory would have been different had I been a person from a lower class, if you will. So again, I guess intersectionality matters because we have another layer, which is class, right? So, and I also do remember reading that even within the Asian labels, particularly lesser known Asian groups like Cambodians and Hmongs, they are of a lower income class, and because of that, they may not have the similar opportunities as they were, you know, the more Eastern Asians, if you will. So that's another level of nuance there. And I think I decided that, I guess, after my first year of my undergrad, right? How many of you have actually felt that actually? Like you have parents that said, oh, you're better off being a medical doctor. You're better off being a nurse. You know, how'd y'all feel about that? Let's help Precious out every day.
Yeah.
Oh, damn, right.
That's a great questions, Precious. And going back to like what Natalie said about, you know, the frustration of the constant assumption that a Filipino can only be in a helping profession, not in a research profession or a generating new knowledge. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with being a nurse because that's a very valuable role and one that's undervalued actually in our society given COVID-19. But I think what helps me kind of through that bias is just reframing our Filipino labor period, and thinking about historically what Filipinos have been able to do in terms of jobs and how they were able to access American society. And you know, in the 1920s, if you read like Carlos Bulosan's America's in the Heart, you learn about the Filipino labor movement and how we were the backbone of the of American agriculture, right? We were farm workers, we were integrated with Mexicans and other immigrant groups. But it wasn't until you know, World War II that we were allowed to gain citizenship. So in terms of immigration, it's always shifting. You know, what does the economy want from us? It really depends. Sometimes they're really pro-immigrant, like I want your labor, and sometimes they're very, you know, anti-immigrant, like now with Trump at the wall. So yeah, there's not anything intrinsically wrong with healthcare, but Filipinos have been pushed to do that labor because it was undesirable at a certain point in history, like in World War II, when it was mostly white nurses in those roles until the war came, and then they wanted cheap labor and people who had a stake in being in the United States, like Filipinos. So, you know, that's where it started, and it's funny that sometimes I'll hear from my partner who works in a hospital in a different, not in a medical capacity whatsoever, it's like more administrative, but someone said to him like, oh, Filipinos, you know, it's just in their soul to like help people, to just be nurses. There's just, that's just not attributing anything to race or ethnicity as natural is always going to be can lead to discrimination, right? And people just ignoring the fact that nursing has always historically been a really rigorous job attributed to, you know, oh, it's just a feminine job, you know, women do that. It's a really like physically challenging and demanding role that the government and hospitals have allowed Filipinos to be underpaid for, right? Because of discrimination, because of you can hold like immigration over people's heads. So I guess when it comes to thinking about like what you want to do as a Filipino, whether it's in science or another field, it's just remembering that we are a valuable resource to this country, and we have been for literally a century. And contributed a lot. So yeah, just let that shape how you navigate this society, and also yeah, think about labor. I am a brain part, but yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Christiana. I'll just say this. I know it's 15 minutes past 8:30. Y'all gotta go now. I totally get it. Does anyone have anything else to say? Rhea, what you think? Just a little we're facilitating this.
I don't know, like, does anyone else have anything else to say? I know, like, you can leave if you have to go, because I know it's Christmas Eve. You might have to prepare for tomorrow or something. But yeah. I guess if, wait, did you unmute, Rose? I saw that.
I was like, it's okay. I think for me, similar with Anthony, my parents did not go to college. My grandparents did not even go to like elementary school. And so from my experience, it's not necessarily the bias of like, oh, you shouldn't go into science because what is that? It's more of the familiarity of what science is. I mean, even up to now, like my parents still don't know what I do. They're like, oh, so you're a doctor now. What hospital are you going to? Are you going to work at Kaiser? I'm like, no, different, but that's okay. But I think that maybe that's also another reason why not many Filipinos are in science, is just this like unawareness of what that field is even. Because we're familiar with nurses, like a lot of my cousins and my family are either caregivers, nurses, nurse assistants, and that like that's what they know, but it's not necessarily a like a downplay in terms of what I'm doing. It's just like not really knowing what I'm doing. So yeah, I guess that's my personal experience with science.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also share because when Dr. Rose said, what do you call that? The familiarity, because I could totally relate with that because my family just moved here like 5 years ago. And so their initial like suggestion for me is to go nursing. While I really like nursing from the very beginning, like I love the job, I love what they do. I think it's something that I could be really good at. Along the way, I figured out that it wasn't really for me. Like I like it. I do like, nurses and I like their job, but it's not for me. And I kind of felt like I was trapped. Like, okay, what can I do that I like, but they also like, or they also know, or they are familiar with. And so to be honest, when I shifted majors into biochemistry, they didn't know that. I just did it for myself because I applied to nursing school in biochemistry because it's something that I really liked. I realized I liked it. And then when I didn't get into nursing school, I told them I got into this major and this university as a biochem major. And then just like what I told in the chat, I was asked, what's your plan with that? And then I was like, okay, I wanted to do this. And then the initial response was like, but what if that doesn't work out? And then I was like, okay, what's the plan B that seems like, I don't know, financially stable whatsoever? And I thought like, okay, I might maybe do CLS. And so like, I don't know, there's that, like I appreciate the concern, but I think it's also the familiarity that they want us to be financially stable in the future, that you don't have to worry about finding a job. And I think that's also like in the mindset of many immigrants, like they just want you to be okay. But then there's a part of me that wants to explore, that wants to, be out there, do things alone. Ayun. So yeah, just want to share that. But they're totally supportive with what I do now. I think there's also like a weird thing of like, I have to kind of prove myself academically that I can do it. And that's something that I still struggle with along the way, but like the pressure, it's gone down. So yeah, just sharing.
Thanks for sharing, Shihan. All right, so we're 9 minutes till 9. Should we clock out for the Kumustahan?
Yeah, we had a great discussion. Thank you, Lowell.
Absolutely. I do apologize for taking this long, but I wish y'all a happy holiday.
Yes, and see you Saturday.
The Christmas thing. Oh yeah, the Christmas
Yeah.
party.
Well,
Yeah,
you'll
yeah, I
receive
remember.
an email today, so don't worry about it.
Okay.
Do we have to bring drinks on Saturday or?
Yeah. So it's like
Okay.
an email. Yes.
Okay.
You'll find out more in the email too. But yeah, yay.
All right. Thank you, Rhea. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Can you all take a photo?
Sure.
There's just us now.
It's small.
No, I think I recorded it, so there should be some grid that I could send to Pop. All right.
Bye.
Happy holidays. Thank you, Lowell.
Thanks all. Bye.
Background.